Well, hey, welcome back, all you fellow modeling fellers and fellettes, to another edition in the Spruce Roving Studio. I want to try something that's really different for me. It's a lot more in the vein of my wearing my hat as the model car genealogist. Um, but drawing inspiration from a few different sources, I decided to see if I can manage to pull off doing some videos that kind of give an overview of model kit companies. So the subject today is the love it or hate it AMT MPC conglomerate round two. So a lot of people know that Round 2 owns the AMT and MPC brands, but there's also a whole bunch of other brands that they own. Some that are still active, some that haven't been active in many, many years. Some that you may didn't know that are all actually part of the same company. So let's follow along while I attempt to give you guys a slideshow and a little bit of a voiceover that hopefully doesn't sound too horrible and isn't too obnoxious. As, like I said, I recorded it here in the truck while I'm on the road. So let's check it out. Alright, follow along on this little journey with me, if you will, as we discuss the history of the company that is currently known today as Round 2. Now, to understand Round 2 and how it got to be the company that it is today, we have to take a little bit of a trip back in time to understand the companies that formed along the way that would eventually be absorbed into the current company of Round 2. So, the history of Round 2 actually goes back almost a century to 1928, when Hawk Model Airplanes was founded by Dick and Phil Mates in Chicago, Illinois, to make what was popular at the time stick and tissue plane kits. So these kits were basically they would cut the sticks to required lengths, they would cut the tissues to required length sizes, put it in a box, and then that's what you would buy, and you would have to um, build them all yourself. In 1933, Paul W. Lindberg starts the Lindberg line with the same stick and tissue planes, but Paul Lindberg, he just made the plans, and you had to cut and assemble the parts by yourself. For a couple of years anyways, because then in 1935, he starts selling entire kits rather than just the parts that you needed to make them. So in 1939, the Pyroplastics Corporation was founded by Bill Lester in Union, New Jersey. In 1946, Lindbergh cooperated with a company called Olson. I have not been able to find much information about what this company Olson was, if it was Olson with an O or Olson with an E, whether it was like an actual business or it was just kind of a group of investors sort of thing. But anyway, they joined together in 1946 and created a company called Olin, which is though from Olson and Lind from Lindbergh. And this is when they started making injection molded plastic kits under this Olin brand. In 1946, Hawk begins producing all-plastic models of planes. And then in 1947, they switched over to the polystyrene plastic, which would end up becoming industry standard. In 1948, Aluminum Model Toys, later known as AMT, was founded by a feller named Wes Gologly Sr. in Troy, Michigan. Gologly, he was an attorney, but he started AMT as a side business because he had a lot of connections with Ford Motor Company. So the first product produced by AMT was a promo of the 1947 and the 1948 Ford. These were made out of pressed aluminum. In the employ of AMT was a guy named George Toteff, who would end up becoming a monumental figure in the history of several model companies along the way. But he invented a sliding mold technique that allowed complex shapes like car bodies to be made out of plastic. These slide molds were essential to be able to create a one-piece body. AMT quickly switched to injected cellulose acetate for the promos instead of pressed aluminum. And then by the early 1950s, Gologly transferred operations of AMT to Toteff. And at this time, when they started out with their plastic injection molding, AMT designed the products and the molds, but the actual production of them was contracted out. Shit. 1948, Aluminum Model Toys, forever after known as AMT, was founded by Wes Gologly Sr. in Troy, Michigan. Gologly was an attorney by trade, but to take advantage of connections that he had with Ford Motor Company, he decided to start AMT as a side business. The very first product that AMT produced was a promo of a 1947 and then 1948 Ford made out of pressed aluminum. So George Toteff was an AMT employee, and he was actually the inventor of a sliding mold technique that allowed complex shapes like car bodies to be made out of plastic. So AMT quickly switched to injected cellulose acetate for promos rather than using the pressed aluminum. By the early 1950s, operations of AMT were transferred to Toteff so that Gologly could focus on his law firm. While AMT designed the products and the molds, the actual production of the model kits was contracted to outside companies. Also in 1948, the Ertl Company was founded by Fred Ertl Sr. in Dubuque, Iowa. Early products by Ertl were die-cast farming equipment. So by the mid-1950s, AMT switches to Cycolac, which is a marketing name for polystyrene, which is, as mentioned before, the current industry standard for plastic model kits. By 1953, Lindberg's partnership with Olson ends, and the kits continue to be produced, but under the Lindberg brand exclusively. The new logo for the Lindberg line, which would stay pretty much all the way up until the end, is created at this time. So 1956, Scale Products, otherwise known as SMP, was founded as a joint venture between AMT and a fellow named Eric Erickson. This was in order to provide promos to General Motors and other auto companies, seeing as how up until this point, AMT was exclusively working with the Ford Motor Company, and so they wanted to be able to make the promos for General Motors brands, but in order to do so, they had to create a second company to make all the contracts look good to the shareholders. So in 1958, AMT started to do a little bit of experimenting to try to maximize their tooling investments. So once they produced all of the promos that they had contracted with auto manufacturers to make for a specific model year, they decided to start adding customizing parts to the unassembled promos, and then they would sell that as a model kit, giving us the very first modeling kits available for the general public, so that you could go and buy in a store instead of having to get a promo from a car dealership. So then in 1959, Ertl moved from Dubuque to Dyersville, Iowa. 1961, with AMT enjoying great success, they constructed a new facility and were able to move all of the design and production into one building. So instead of having to contract out the production of all of the plastic injection molding, they brought everything in-house. And then they purchased the remaining interest of SMP from Ericsson and discontinued the SMP brand. As part of this merger of SMP and AMT, we ended up with the now familiar AMT logo that is still used today. So 1961, Palmer Plastics, which is a company that would make a whole bunch of different plastic products, and they decided to get in on this new fad of plastic model kits. Todef left AMT on good terms, and he went on to found Model Products Corporation, otherwise known as MPC. Those earliest of MPC products would be co-produced with AMT while MPC was getting themselves set up as a separate company. Also in 1963, the Industrial Motive Corporation, which was another plastics producer just like Pyro and Palmer, started producing model kits. In 1965, the first full kits under MPC brand introduced. Like I said, the previous versions were co-branded with AMT. Also around this time, MPC started a product sharing agreement with Airfix. So MPC would gain European distribution of aircraft kits for domestic market, and Airfix gained North American distribution and automotive kits for the European market. So 1967, Ertl was purchased by the Victor Comptometer Corporation, which made business machines. And then in 1970, MPC was purchased by General Mills, and they combined it with Lionel Trains, another company that they had acquired, and they formed the Fun Group. This name was short-lived, and they later changed it to be Fun Dimensions. So 1970, the Hawk Plastic Bottle Company was purchased by the Testers Corporation. Also in 1970, there was a bit of a situation, I guess you would say. Monogram sued IMC for copyright infringement, alleging copying of their aircraft kits. IMC refused to respond to the allegations. The suit was decided in favor of Monogram, and although IMC appealed twice, the verdict was upheld by 1974. 1970, Pyro purchased Palmer's model kit assets. Palmer decided that the model kits wasn't worth their investment to keep going with it, so they just sold them all to Pyro, and then Palmer continued with the rest of their plastic production business. In 1972, Lifelike, which was a major train layout manufacturer, they purchased Pyro and Palmer and started producing some kits under their own brand. By 1974, IMC just gave up on trying to do model kits altogether, and they continue with the rest of their business model, producing other plastic products and other items, but no more model kits. So then in 1975, Lindberg came and purchased the Pyro and Palmer brands from Lifelike Trains. And then from this point on, Lindberg would start reissuing Pyro and Palmer model kits under the Lindberg badging. So 1977, the Victor Comptometer Corporation was purchased by Kitty, which was in turn owned by United Technologies. The end result of this whole shenanigan was that Ertl was several layers removed from the overall owner and management of the company, but they had access to a lot of cash with not a lot of questions going to be asked about what they were doing with that cash. So then in 1977, Testers, which had already purchased Hawk plastic models, purchased the assets of IMC. So IMC was still under operating business, doing their own thing, but they had all these molds for model kits that they weren't doing anything with, and they decided to just get rid of them. So Testers got a hold of those and started reissuing the formerly IMC kits under their own brand. 1978, AMT was purchased by Lesney Products Corporation Limited. Products are now co-branded as AMT and Matchbox. Lesney moved production from the AMT facility in Troy, Michigan to Baltimore, Maryland. They also consolidated a bunch of their operations, and by this point, AMT was not so much an independent company anymore, and it was pretty much just a brand of whoever owned the rights to it. So, in 1981, seeing as how Lesney wasn't really having much success with AMT ownership, they decided to divest themselves of it and sold AMT to Ertl. And so Ertl took the AMT production, all of the molds and everything, to Dyersville, Iowa. And then from this point on, the AMT kits would be co-branded as AMT Ertl. And this arrangement would last for several decades. So in 1981, General Mills just outright purchased Airfix. remember that Airfix had been distributed in the North America by MPC. So as part of that relationship, somehow General Mills was able to purchase the Airfix company, and they rolled it into the Fundimensions brand. So in 1984, RPM International Inc. purchases Testers, which had also already owned Hawk plastic models and the IMC assets. 1985 was a bit of a big shakeup. So Ertl purchased the Fundimensions brand from General Mills. So MPC, Airfix, and Lionel and joined AMT over at Ertl. So that from this point on, you ended up with such things as MPC Ertl products, AMT Ertl, and Lionel Ertl, and maybe even a few Airfix Ertl kits. But not for long, because then in 1986, Airfix purchased Humbrol purchased Airfix from Ertl and took over ownership of the brand. And then in 1986, also, Lionel was purchased from Ertl by Richard Kuhn, who was a really big fan of Lionel trains and had enough money to make the transaction happen. So 1987, Ertl acquires majority stakeholder status of the Italian model company Eschi, which it had been the U.S. distributor for. So this was added to the growing stable of co-branded products. So you now had AMT Ertl, MPC Ertl, and Eschi Ertl. 1989, Craft House of Toledo, Ohio, purchased the Lindberg line. So this also included the Pyro and Palmer kits. And they hired that little old fella that we've heard of a couple of times, George Todeff, to run the Lindberg line. By 1989, the MPC brand was kind of phased out. It didn't seem that any new products were being released under the MPC brand, and anything that was coming out labeled as MPC was reissues of already existing products. So in the 1990s, Tester entered into an agreement with Lindberg, and so this would result in Lindberg reboxing some of their kits to sell as Testers, and then Testers also hired Lindberg to design brand new kits that would initially be released under the Testers brand for a short exclusive period, and then they would end up being reissued again as Lindberg kits. By 1991, Ertl had decreased the Eschi catalog to 2/3 of its pre-acquisition contents. So they were pretty much slashing anything out of the Eschi catalog that wasn't meeting their sales requirements, I guess you could say. And then by 1993, Ertl just liquidated the Eschi tooling bank. The very best sellers out of what remained was kept, and it produced under the bizarre AMT Eschi Ertl brand for a little while. So in 1994, there's a feller named Tom Lowe. He relaunched Johnny Lightning, which was a brand that he remembered from his childhood. The original brand was owned by Topper Toys from 1969 to 1971. Now, Tom Lowe had a company that I have not been able to find too much information about, but it was called Safe Care, and it was mostly concerned with producing like pop culture memorabilia stuff, I think. But in 1994, he rebranded that name Safe Care to become Playing Mantis. And then Tom Lowe was also able to launch an entirely new brand of products, which would include model kits, Polar Lights, which is an homage to Aurora. Aurora, Polar Lights, Aurora Borealis, Northern Lights. You can see where the connection is there, right? So 1999, Racing Champions purchased Ertl, which also owned AMT and MPC. So 1999, a really big consolidating effort occurred. So, J. Lloyd International was able to purchase the Lindberg line from Craft House. And then they also purchased Hawk and IMC from RPM. So that brought under one owner the Lindberg, Pyro, Palmer, Hawk, and IMC brands. And a bunch of these kits ended up getting re-released under J. Lloyd ownership. Some of them in their original brandings. So you would have Lindberg kits and Hawk kits. No IMC kits, though. And then in 2000, any of the remaining Eschi molds that were still owned by Ertl and weren't being sold under AMT brands, everything else was sold to Italeri. In 2004, Racing Champions was purchased by RC2 to acquire the lucrative diecast properties. And they didn't really have much of an interest in plastic models, like, whatsoever. And they also purchased Playing Mantis in 2004. Possibly for the same reasons. A little bit fuzzy on what exactly this all entailed. I don't know if it was kind of like a hostile takeover where, Tom Lowe didn't really want to sell Playing Mantis, but he may have been outvoted on that. But anyway, RC2 purchased both Racing Champions and Playing Mantis. So, in an effort to find sellers for the model kits that they didn't have any interest in going through all the effort themselves, they had this catalog of molds of model kits that they knew could be a revenue stream, but they didn't want to spend the time and money that would required for them to be able to do it themselves. So, rather than doing the production in-house or, going through the effort of finding production facilities for the molds, picking which ones to produce, all that kind of stuff, they just decided to enter into licensing agreements with any companies that could come up with a plan. So you would choose a mold or set of molds that you knew existed, were viable, and could sell. And then you would purchase a run of these from RC2, but you would have to arrange for a plant to produce them and to get all of that. Basically, RC2 would lease the molds to you you would be able to use them, but everything that came along with being able to use them was all on you. They just said, hey, you could use it, but how? That's up to you. So that saw the introduction of companies like the Model King, Dirt Track Race Cars, Hobby Heaven, and Stevens International that all did runs of basically private label runs of these products on their own, and then they were responsible for all the distribution. So then by 2005, RC2 started with the cuts. They shut down the Johnny Lightning, Polar Lights, and Playing Mantis brands altogether. And then in 2005, a feller by the name of John Gretschula founds Retro Hobby to produce and distribute a series of custom trike kits from the MPC tooling bank. Now, as part of this process, John Gretschula basically, well, I won't say it was only John Gretschula, but Retro Hobby went through and they located the tooling for the custom trike kits. They designed the box art, the instructions, the decals. They did everything. They did all the marketing, and they actually had really good success with this. And all of the efforts that they put into this rekindled interest in the MPC brand. So, in 2005, Tom Lowe founds Round 2 as his second try to create a toy company. In 2008, RC2 was purchased by Takara Tomy. And in 2008, our Round 2 licensed production of the MPC and AMT model kits from Tomy. And then in 2011, Round 2 just went and purchased the AMT and MPC and Polar Lights brands outright and their assets from Tomy. So rather than just leasing the molds for production, as Model King and Stevens International had done, they wanted to have complete ownership of the molds, so that's what they did. They also purchased any of the Ertl plastic model kits that existed in the tooling bank. But Ertl itself is a separate brand that was by this time disconnected from the line of model kits. So Round 2 owns the molds and can use them, but just not the Ertl branding. So it's kind of a similar situation to the whole IMC thing, where the kits exist, but they're not under that brand name anymore. So then in 2013, the last major acquisition of the Round 2 era occurred when Round 2 purchased from J. Lloyd International the Lindberg, Hawk and Lindberg division is what it was called, but Lindberg also included Pyro and Palmer and the assets to IMC. And then by this point in time, any product sharing agreements that Lindberg still had with testers is pretty much moot. So then in 2016, Round 2 was finally able to purchase the assets of the Johnny Lightning brand and relaunched it for the third time. That brings us to the current incarnation of Round 2 that exists today. So, Round 2 is actually made up of the assets of a whole bunch of old modeling companies. So you have Lindberg, Pyro, Palmer, IMC, Hawk, AMT, MPC, Polar Lights, Ertl, and Johnny Lightning. It seems that current practices over at Round 2 are mostly focused on the AMT, MPC, and Polar Lights brands. Um, Previous kits that were released under the Lindberg, that were like originally tooled by Lindberg, um, are now branded as AMT. New tool products tend to come out as AMT or Polar Lights, depending on the subject matter. Johnny Lightning is usually used for all of their diecast properties. So they use it for like 1/64th scale and some slot cars, I think. But Hawk and Lindberg have kind of fallen out of use. And then Pyro and Palmer have not been used as brands in a very, very long time. So this is kind of just a brief overview of what brought us to the Round 2 company today. This is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list of the people involved, any kind of groundbreaking products that they had. Just kind of an overview of all the different brands that actually make up Round 2, and hopefully this might help with some confusion that people may have about different reboxings of different kits under different brand names, because it can be a little bit of a confusing mess when you start researching kits and where they came from. But to the best of my knowledge, this is what I've been able to piece together. So I just want to thank everybody for following along to my ramblings to try to figure out how we got to today's Round 2.